Shopkeeper murdered in 1984. Robbery gone wrong? Chapter 1. Glasgow, March 1984. The city was caught between two identities, straddling the line between its industrial past and an uncertain future. While city leaders promoted Glasgow as miles better, with their optimistic marketing campaign, the reality on the ground told a different story. Unemployment was high, crime was rising, and the housing schemes on the outskirts were becoming battlegrounds for various criminal enterprises. It was a city of stark contrasts, where trendy wine bars opened in the city center, while the suburbs dealt with gang violence and the so-called ice cream wars that would soon shock the nation. Arthur MacLeod's hardware shop sat on Maryhill Road, a busy thoroughfare that had seen better days, but still served as the commercial heart of the Maryhill neighborhood. The shop had been there since 1956, when Arthur had opened it with money saved from his years working in the shipyards. It was a traditional establishment, the kind of place where locals came not just for screws and paint, but for advice, conversation, and a connection to community. The shop front was painted a faded green, with MacLeod's hardware written in gold lettering that Arthur repainted himself every few years. The windows displayed an assortment of tools, gardening supplies, and household items, arranged with a practical eye rather than any sense of modern merchandising. Inside, the shop had the comfortable clutter of a place that had accumulated inventory over decades, narrow aisles lined with shelves reaching to the ceiling, the smell of linseed oil and metal and dust combining into an oddly pleasant scent that customers associated with reliability and honest work. Arthur was 52 years old, a stocky man with thick gray hair and hands marked by years of manual labor. He had lost his wife Helen to cancer 3 years earlier, and the shop had become both his livelihood and his refuge, a place where he could focus on tangible problems with concrete solutions. He opened at 8 every morning except Sunday, closed at 6 in the evening, and knew most of his customers by name. On the morning of March 8, 1984, Arthur arrived at the shop at his usual time, unlocking the front door and disabling the alarm system with the 4-digit code he had used for years. He moved through his morning routine with the efficiency of long practice, turning on lights, checking the till, reviewing the order book, setting out the items he planned to display in the front window. Graham Fraser arrived at 8:30. He was 31, tall and thin with an earnest manner that Arthur had initially found appealing when he had hired him 3 years ago. Graham had worked in retail before, knew hardware well enough, and was reliable in his attendance and reasonably competent in his work. What Arthur hadn't known when he hired Graham was that the young man would develop romantic feelings for his daughter Sheila. "Morning, Arthur," Graham said, hanging his jacket on the hook by the back door. "Morning," Arthur replied, his tone somewhat cooler than it once had been. "Need you to check the inventory on the electrical supplies. We had an order yesterday that seemed short." "Right. I'll get on that." The two men worked in relative silence for the first hour, a tension between them that had been growing over the past 6 months. Arthur had discovered the relationship between Graham and Sheila quite by accident, coming home early one evening to find them together in his living room, clearly more than friends. The discovery had infuriated him, not because Graham was a bad person, but because Arthur felt betrayed. He had trusted this man, given him steady employment, and Graham had taken advantage of that trust to pursue his daughter behind his back. Sheila, who was 27 and perfectly capable of making her own decisions, had been furious at her father's reaction. They had argued bitterly, with Sheila pointing out that she was an adult, and Arthur insisting that Graham had violated an unspoken boundary. The relationship between father and daughter had been strained ever since. Arthur had considered sacking Graham but had held back for practical reasons. Finding a reliable employee wasn't easy, and despite everything, Graham did his work well. But Arthur had made his position clear. The relationship with Sheila needed to end, or Graham's employment would. Graham had nodded and said he understood, but Arthur suspected the affair was continuing in secret. It made the atmosphere in the shop uncomfortable, each man aware of the unspoken conflict between them. The morning passed slowly. A steady stream of customers came through, mostly regulars. Mrs. Patterson looking for drawer handles, old Mr. McGregor needing screws for a project he was working on, young Tommy Hughes buying paint for his mother. Arthur served them with his usual efficiency, making small talk, offering advice, processing payments with the mechanical ease of long practice. At noon, Graham went out for his lunch break, and Arthur was left alone in the shop. He ate his sandwich in the back room, reading the Glasgow Herald, and thinking about nothing in particular. The paper was full of news about unemployment figures and political debates about the miners' strike that was threatening to paralyze the country. Arthur read it all with detached interest, more focused on the crossword puzzle than the headlines. Graham returned at 1, and the afternoon continued much like the morning. More customers, more transactions, the rhythmic routine of retail work. At 5 o'clock, Mrs. Campbell came in asking about paint colors for her kitchen, and Arthur spent 20 minutes with her going through sample cards and making recommendations. It was the kind of customer service that had kept the shop viable through changing times, the personal attention that the big DIY chains couldn't match. At 10 minutes to 6, Arthur began the closing routine. Graham had left at his usual time, 5:45, and Arthur was alone. He counted the till, pleased to find they had taken in nearly £250, a good day by recent standards. He made notes in the ledger, recording the day's business with the meticulous attention to detail that had always characterized his work. At exactly 6 o'clock, Arthur locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed. He did a final walkthrough of the shop, checking that everything was secure, that no taps had been left running in the small bathroom at the back, that the lights were all working properly. That's when he heard the knock at the back door. Arthur paused, frowning. Deliveries didn't come this late, and anyone with legitimate business would have come during shop hours. He walked to the back door and called out, "We're closed, come back tomorrow." A voice came through the door, muffled but recognizable. "Arthur, it's me. Can I have a quick word?" "It's important." Arthur knew that voice. He hesitated for a moment, then unlocked the door and opened it. "What do you want?" Arthur asked, his tone wary. "I've told you," but he didn't finish the sentence. The person at the door pushed past him, moving into the back room with an urgency that immediately put Arthur on edge. "I need to talk to you," the visitor said, "about what you're planning." "You can't do it, Arthur. You can't just—" "I can do what I like," Arthur interrupted. "It's my business, my decision. But what about the rest of us? What about the people who depend on this place?" "You'll find other work," Arthur said dismissively. "I'm not responsible for everyone's life." The conversation escalated quickly, voices rising, anger building. Arthur was tired of explaining himself, tired of dealing with other people's expectations and demands. He had built this business, run it for nearly 3 decades, and if he wanted to sell it and retire, that was his right. But his visitor saw things differently, saw Arthur's decision as a betrayal, as selfish disregard for others. The argument grew heated, words becoming sharper, more accusatory. Arthur turned away, intending to end the conversation by force of will, simply walking back toward the front of the shop and making it clear the discussion was over. But as he turned, his visitor's hand fell on a wrench lying on the workbench, a heavy 18-inch adjustable spanner that Arthur used for various repairs. What happened next occurred in a blur of motion and rage. The wrench came down hard on the back of Arthur's head. He staggered, surprised more than hurt at first, but as he tried to turn, to defend himself, the blow was repeated. Again and again, the heavy tool connected with his skull, driven by a combination of fury and fear and the terrible momentum of violence once started. Arthur fell to his knees, then forward onto his face, blood spreading across the concrete floor of the back room. His attacker stood over him, breathing hard, staring at the wrench in their hand as if seeing it for the first time, unable to quite process what had just happened. Arthur MacLeod was dead, killed in his own shop by someone he had known, someone he had trusted enough to open the door to after closing time. The cash register sat untouched in the front of the shop, £247 still in the drawer. It wasn't robbery. It was something far more personal, far more complicated. His killer stood in the growing darkness of the back room, trying to think, trying to figure out what to do next. The alarm system was off, disabled with the proper code. No one had seen them enter through the back door. If they were careful, if they didn't panic, they might get away with this. They laid the wrench beside Arthur's body, wiped their hands on a rag, and slipped out the back door into the gathering dusk, leaving Arthur MacLeod cooling on the floor of the shop he had built with his own hands. Chapter 2. Sheila MacLeod stood in front of her Year 4 class at Whiteinch Primary School, leading her students through a geography lesson about Scottish rivers, when the school secretary appeared at the classroom door. The woman's face was pale, her expression suggesting bad news. "Miss MacLeod, could you step outside for a moment, please?" Sheila assigned her class some quiet work and followed the secretary into the hallway, her stomach tightening with instinctive dread. Bad news delivered during the school day was never good. "There are 2 police officers in the head teacher's office," the secretary said quietly. "They need to speak with you. Mrs. Davidson said I should bring you straight away." Sheila's mouth went dry. Police. Office. Her father. She practically ran down the corridor, her sensible teacher's shoes squeaking on the linoleum. The 2 officers stood when she entered, their faces professionally sympathetic, in a way that told her everything before they spoke. "Miss MacLeod?" the older one said. He was perhaps 45, with graying hair and tired eyes. "I'm Detective Inspector William Thomson, and this is Detective Sergeant Claire Morrison. I'm afraid we have some very bad news. Your father was found dead this morning at his shop. I'm very sorry for your loss." The words seemed to come from very far away, filtered through a roaring in Sheila's ears. Dead. Father. Shop. The pieces didn't fit together properly in her mind. "What? How?" she managed to ask. "We're treating it as a suspicious death," Thomson said carefully. "He was found by a customer who came to the shop this morning. The circumstances suggest foul play. I know this is difficult, but we'll need to ask you some questions when you're ready." Sheila sat down heavily in the chair that Mrs. Davidson pushed toward her, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. Her father was dead. Murdered. It didn't seem real. Didn't seem possible. She had just seen him 2 days ago, had argued with him as they had been arguing for months now, about Graham, about her right to choose her own relationships, about whether she was being foolish or he was being controlling. And now he was dead, and they would never have the chance to repair things between them. "Was it a robbery?" Sheila asked, grasping for logic, for explanation. The shop had been broken into twice before, once in the 70s and once about 5 years ago. Her father had always said it was an occupational hazard of retail, especially in times of high unemployment. "We're not certain yet," D.S. Morrison said. She was younger than Thomson, perhaps 30, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything. "The scene is complicated. We'll know more after the forensic team has finished their examination. Miss MacLeod, is there somewhere you'd like us to take you? Family you'd like us to contact?" Sheila shook her head. She was an only child, and with her mother dead 3 years now, her father had been her only close family. There were distant cousins somewhere in Edinburgh, but she hadn't seen them in years. "Graham," she said suddenly. "Graham Fraser. He worked for my father. He'll need to know. And we're together. I need to call him." Thomson and Morrison exchanged a glance that Sheila couldn't quite interpret. "We'll be speaking to Mr. Fraser as part of our investigation," Thomson said carefully. "He was one of the last people to see your father alive." The implication hung in the air, and Sheila felt a flash of anger cut through her shock. "Graham didn't do this. Whatever you're thinking, you're wrong. He and my father had their differences, but Graham would never—" "We're not accusing anyone," Morrison said quickly. "We're just gathering information at this stage. But you should know that your father was killed with a wrench from the shop itself. There was no sign of forced entry. The alarm had been properly disabled. Whoever did this either had access to the code or was let in by your father after he'd closed up." The words struck Sheila, like physical blows. No forced entry. Alarm disabled. Someone her father knew. Someone he had trusted enough to let into the shop after hours. "The alarm code," Sheila said slowly. "Dad, Graham, and Brian Kelley, the accountant. Those were the only people who had it. Dad was very careful about security." "Brian Kelley," Thomson repeated, making a note. "We'll need to speak with him as well. Miss MacLeod, I know this is overwhelming, but we need to move quickly in the first hours of an investigation. Would you be willing to come to the station and make a statement? Tell us everything you know about your father's business, his relationships, any problems he might have been having?" Sheila nodded numbly. What else could she do? Her father was dead, murdered by someone he knew, someone who had killed him in his own shop and left him there overnight. She needed to help the police find whoever had done this. She needed answers, needed justice, needed to understand how something so terrible could have happened. But even as she agreed to go with the detectives, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered a terrible question. What if it was Graham? What if her father's refusal to accept their relationship had pushed Graham too far? What if the man she loved had killed the father she had been unable to reconcile with? She pushed the thought away violently, refusing to entertain it. Graham was gentle, patient, kind. He wouldn't hurt anyone. He couldn't have done this. But as they drove to the police station, Sheila found herself remembering moments that suddenly seemed darker in this new light. Graham's frustration when Arthur had confronted him about the relationship. The anger in his voice when he said Arthur was being unreasonable, controlling, impossible to satisfy. The the way his hands had clenched into fists when Arthur had threatened his job. Had it been enough? Had Arthur pushed Graham to the breaking point? Sheila stared out the window at the gray Glasgow streets and prayed that when they found the killer, it would be anyone, absolutely anyone, except the man she loved. Chapter 3. Detective Inspector William Thomson sat in the interview room at Maryhill Police Station, reviewing the initial reports from the crime scene. Arthur MacLeod's hardware shop had been thoroughly examined by the forensic team, photographed from every angle, dusted for fingerprints, searched for evidence. The findings were simultaneously straightforward and baffling. Arthur had been killed by multiple blows to the head with an 18-inch adjustable wrench, which had been found beside his body. Time of death was estimated between 6 and 8 o'clock the previous evening, based on body temperature and rigor mortis. The back door had been unlocked but showed no signs of forced entry. The alarm system had been properly disarmed using the correct code. The cash register contained £247, completely untouched. There was no evidence of ransacking or searching. Whatever had happened in that back room, it wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Thomson had been with Strathclyde Police for 23 years, working his way up from constable to detective inspector. He had seen countless murders, from domestic violence to gang killings to the occasional truly bizarre case. But this one had the hallmarks of something complicated, something that would require careful, methodical investigation. 3 people with the alarm code, DS Claire Morrison said, entering the room with 3 steaming cups of tea. She set one in front of Thomson and kept the other 2 for herself and the constable taking notes. Graham Fraser, the employee, Brian Kelley, the accountant, and Arthur himself. And the daughter? Thomson asked. Sheila says she never had the code. Her father didn't want her involved in the shop, thought it wasn't appropriate work for a woman. Old-fashioned type, apparently. Thomson sipped his tea, thinking. So, we have an inside job, almost certainly. Someone Arthur knew well enough to either give them the code or let them in after closing. The question is motive. Could still be robbery, Morrison suggested, though her tone indicated she didn't really believe it. Killer panicked after the murder, fled without taking anything. Doesn't fit, Thomson said. The wrench wasn't brought to the scene. It was a weapon of opportunity, grabbed in the moment. That suggests the killing wasn't planned. But if someone came to rob the place and got into an argument that escalated to murder, why did Arthur let them in after hours? Why disable the alarm? Morrison nodded. Personal conflict, then. Business dispute. Relationship problem. Old grudge. Let's start with Graham Fraser. He's got the most obvious tension with the victim. Bring him in. Graham Fraser arrived at the station at 11 o'clock, his face pale, and his hands shaking. He had been at the school where Sheila taught when the police contacted him, and he looked like a man whose world had just collapsed. Thomson and Morrison let him sit in the interview room for 10 minutes before entering, a standard technique to increase anxiety and see how the suspect handled stress. When they finally entered, Graham looked up with red-rimmed eyes. I didn't do it, he said immediately. I know how it looks. But I didn't kill Arthur. Mr. Fraser, Thomson began, settling into his chair with deliberate calm. We need to ask you some questions about yesterday evening. Where were you between 6 and 8 p.m.? At home, Graham said. I left work at 5:45, walked home, got there around 6. I made myself dinner, watched television. I was alone. No one can verify that? No, I live alone. It's a bedsit in Partick. My landlady might have seen me come in, but I don't know. Tell me about your relationship with Arthur MacLeod, Thomson said. Graham took a shaky breath. He was my employer. I'd worked for him for 3 years. It was good at first. Arthur was fair, paid decent wages, taught me a lot about the business. But then Sheila and we started seeing each other about a year ago. Arthur found out 6 months back and he went mad. Told me I'd taken advantage, that I'd betrayed his trust. He wanted me to end it with Sheila, or he'd sack me. And did you? End it? Graham hesitated. I told him I would, but Sheila and we kept seeing each other, secretly. Arthur didn't know, or if he did, he didn't say anything, but things were tense between us. Every day at work was uncomfortable. Did you have access to the alarm code? Yes. Arthur gave it to me when I started. He needed someone who could open up if he was sick or running late. Did you go back to the shop yesterday evening after you left? No, I went straight home. Why did Arthur trust you with the alarm code if he was so angry with you about his daughter? Graham looked down at his hands. I don't know. Maybe he meant to change it and never got around to it. Maybe he thought I wouldn't betray him in that way, even if I had about Sheila. I honestly don't know. Thomson leaned forward. Were you angry with Arthur? Did you resent the way he was treating you? Of course I was angry, Graham said, his voice rising. He was being completely unreasonable. Sheila's a grown woman. She can see whoever she wants. But I didn't kill him. I swear to God I didn't touch him. The murder weapon was a wrench from the shop, Morrison said. You would have known exactly where to find it. So would anyone who worked there or spent any time there, Graham shot back. Arthur kept his tools on the workbench in the back room. They weren't hidden. The interview continued for another 40 minutes, Thomson and Morrison probing every aspect of Graham's relationship with Arthur, his movements the previous evening, his financial situation, his emotional state. Graham remained consistent in his story, but became increasingly agitated, eventually demanding a lawyer. Thomson let him go, but instructed a constable to keep an eye on him. Graham was their strongest suspect at this point, with clear motive and opportunity. The lack of alibi was damaging, but Thomson's instincts told him there was more to this case than a romantic conflict gone violent. Bring in the accountant, Thomson told Morrison. Brian Kelley. Let's see what he has to say. Brian Kelley was 56 years old, balding, with the slightly paunchy build of a man who spent his days sitting at a desk. He arrived at the station in a three-piece suit, carrying a briefcase, looking every inch the professional businessman. But Thomson noted that his hands trembled slightly as he sat down, and there was sweat on his upper lip despite the cool temperature of the room. Mr. Kelley, Thomson began. Thank you for coming in. We need to ask you some questions about Arthur MacLeod. Terrible business, Kelley said, his voice carefully modulated. Arthur was a good man, a friend as well as a client. I can't imagine who would do such a thing. How long had you known Mr. MacLeod? 15 years. I took over his accounts in 1969 when the previous accountant retired. I handled all the financial side of the business. Tax returns, payroll, accounts receivable, everything. Were you aware of any financial problems with the business? Kelley hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but Thomson caught it. Hardware shops like Arthur's, they face challenges. The big DIY chains are taking over. B&Q, Texas Home Care. They're opening massive stores with lower prices. Small independents struggle to compete. Was Arthur's shop in financial difficulty? Not difficulty exactly, but the profit margins were shrinking. Arthur was aware he couldn't compete on price, so he competed on service. Personal attention, expert advice, that sort of thing. It worked well enough, but it wasn't making him rich. Was he considering selling the business? Kelley's face tightened. He mentioned it once or twice, but I didn't think he was serious. You didn't think he was serious? Or you didn't want him to be serious? I don't understand what you're implying, Inspector. Thomson leaned back in his chair. Mr. Kelley, we've spoken to several people who told us that Arthur was actively seeking buyers for his shop. He had contacted a commercial property agent. He was planning to sell within the next 6 months. If he sold, you would lose him as a client, wouldn't you? After 15 years of steady income from managing his accounts. Kelley's face flushed. Yes, all right. I knew he was planning to sell. And yes, I was upset about it. Arthur was one of my oldest clients. But I certainly didn't kill him over it. That's ridiculous. Where were you yesterday evening between 6 and 8? At my office. I was working late, catching up on paperwork. I left around 8:30, went home to my wife. Can anyone verify you were at your office? The building has a security guard. He would have seen me leave. As for being there earlier, I was alone. My secretary leaves at 5. Do you have access to the alarm code for Arthur's shop? Yes. Arthur gave it to me years ago. Sometimes I needed to access the shop after hours to review inventory or check on something for the accounts. When was the last time you used the alarm code? Months ago. Maybe October or November. I can't remember exactly. Thomson made notes, his face neutral. Mr. Kelley, did you argue with Arthur about his decision to sell the business? We discussed it, Kelley said carefully. I expressed my concerns. I told him I thought he was making a mistake, that the shop was still viable, that he was giving up too easily, but it was his decision. I accepted that. Did you argue with him yesterday evening? No, I told you. I was at my office. I hadn't spoken to Arthur since Tuesday. Thomson studied Kelley's face, looking for tells, for signs of deception. The man was nervous, definitely hiding something. But was it guilt for murder, or just general anxiety about being questioned by police? We'll need to verify your whereabouts with the building security guard, Thomson said. We'll be in touch if we have further questions. After Kelley left, Morrison turned to Thomson. He's lying about something. Agreed. But lying about what? About killing Arthur? Or about something else? He had motive. Losing a long-term client would hurt his business. It's weak motive for murder, Thomson said. But people have killed for less. Check his alibi with the security guard. And I want to know more about Arthur's finances. See if there's anything else Kelley might have been worried about. Chapter 4. By the end of the first day of investigation, Thomson had interviewed 6 people and reviewed dozens of reports. The picture that emerged was of a man who inspired strong feelings in those around him. Loyalty, frustration, affection, resentment. Arthur MacLeod had been respected but not always liked, principled but stubborn, generous to those he deemed worthy, but harsh to those who disappointed him. The physical evidence was frustratingly sparse. The murder weapon had yielded fingerprints, but they were all Arthur's own, suggesting the killer had either worn gloves or wiped the wrench clean before dropping it. The back door showed no signs of forced entry, confirming that Arthur had either let his killer in or the killer had a key. A search of Arthur's personal effects had turned up a key ring with keys for the shop, his car, and his home, but no record of any additional copies being made. The cash register being untouched seemed to rule out robbery as a motive, but Thomson had learned long ago not to make assumptions. He had seen killers panic and flee before completing their intended crime, though usually there would be some sign of searching or attempted theft. On the second day of the investigation, Thomson received an interesting report from the forensic team. They had found traces of cigarette ash near Arthur's body, a specific brand called Embassy Filter. The ash had been fresh, certainly deposited on the day of the murder or shortly before. Did Arthur smoke? Thomson asked Morrison. According to his daughter, he quit 5 years ago after his wife died. She begged him to stop, worried about his health. What about Fraser and Kelley? Morrison checked her notes. Fraser smokes Silk Cut. Kelley doesn't smoke at all, claims he never has. So we're looking for someone who smokes Embassy Filter, Thomson said. Not definitive, but useful. Or someone who was in the shop earlier that day and happened to drop ash, Morrison cautioned. It's a shop. People come and go all day. Thomson nodded, but filed the information away. Every detail mattered, even the apparently insignificant ones. The investigation took a turn on the third day, when a former employee of Arthur's came forward. Robert Bobby Sinclair was 34, unemployed, with a record of petty theft and assault. He walked into the police station voluntarily, which immediately made Thomson suspicious. People with criminal records didn't usually volunteer information to police, unless they had a reason. I heard about Arthur, Sinclair said, when Thomson brought him into an interview room. Thought I should tell you I might be a suspect. And why would you be a suspect, Mr. Sinclair? Because Arthur sacked me 6 months ago. We had a row about it. I said some things I shouldn't have, threatened him like, but I didn't kill him. I swear on my mother's life I didn't touch him. What did you say to him? Sinclair looked uncomfortable. I told him he'd regret it, that he couldn't treat people like rubbish and get away with it, that one day someone would make him pay. Stupid stuff, said in anger. I was drunk and upset about losing my job. Why did he sack you? He caught me taking money from the till. It was only 20 quid here and there, just to help make ends meet. I was having financial problems. My wife had just left me. I was desperate, but Arthur didn't care about excuses. He called me a thief and told me to get out. Where were you on the evening of March 8th? At the pub, the Crown on Maryhill Road. I was there from 5 until closing. Barman can confirm it. So can half a dozen regulars. Thomson made notes. If Sinclair's alibi checked out, he could be eliminated as a suspect despite the clear motive and the threats he had made. But the fact that he had come in voluntarily suggested he was either genuinely innocent or playing a clever double game, establishing an alibi preemptively. Do you smoke, Mr. Sinclair? Aye. Embassy Filter. Why? Thomson kept his face neutral. Just routine questions. We'll need to verify your alibi with the pub. Don't leave Glasgow without informing us. After Sinclair left, Morrison raised her eyebrows. Convenient. Comes in to confess he made threats. Happens to have an alibi for the time of the murder. Too convenient? Thomson asked. Maybe. Or maybe he's just smart enough to know we'd find out about the threats anyway, and wanted to get ahead of it. Check his alibi thoroughly, Thomson ordered. Talk to everyone who was at the pub that night, and find out if there's any way he could have slipped out, committed the murder, and returned without being missed. The investigation continued through the following week. Thomson and his team interviewed dozens of people. Arthur's customers, neighbors, other shopkeepers on Maryhill Road, anyone who might have information about his final days. A pattern emerged of a man who was well regarded in the community, but had accumulated his share of resentments. A customer he had refused credit to, a supplier he had argued with over quality issues, a competitor who had lost business to him. But none of these led to solid suspects. The case kept coming back to the three people with alarm codes: Graham Fraser, Brian Kelley, and the victim himself. One of them had either killed Arthur or given the code to someone who had. Thomson was reviewing the case files late one evening when Morrison knocked on his office door. "Bobby Sinclair's alibi checks out," she said. "He was at the pub. Multiple witnesses confirm he was there all evening, never left except to use the toilet, and even then someone was with him. He's clear." Thomson rubbed his tired eyes. "Which brings us back to Fraser and Kelley, or someone else Arthur let in that we haven't identified yet." "There is another possibility," Morrison said, hesitantly. "The daughter, Sheila." Thomson looked up sharply. "She didn't have the alarm code, that we know of. But what if Arthur gave it to her at some point and didn't tell anyone? What if she used it to get into the shop, confronted her father about his treatment of Graham, and things escalated? What's her motive? Protection of her relationship. Arthur was threatening Graham's job, essentially forcing Sheila to choose between her father and the man she loved. Maybe she snapped. Decided to confront him, things got heated, she grabbed the wrench. Thomson considered it. Sheila had seemed genuinely shocked and grief-stricken when they informed her of her father's death, but he had seen good actors before, people who could fake emotion convincingly, and the most obvious suspects weren't always the guilty ones. "Bring her in again," Thomson said. "Let's push her harder this time." Chapter 5. Sheila MacLeod sat across from Thomson and Morrison in the interview room, her face drawn and exhausted. She had barely slept since her father's death, spending her days dealing with funeral arrangements and her nights replaying every conversation, every argument, wondering if she could have done something differently. "Miss MacLeod," Thomson began, his voice gentle but firm, "we need to go over your statement again. There are some inconsistencies we need to clarify." "What inconsistencies?" Sheila asked, her voice hoarse. "You told us you didn't have the alarm code for your father's shop. Are you certain about that?" "Yes. Dad never gave it to me. He didn't think I should be involved in the business. It was old-fashioned, but that's how he was." "Did you ever ask him for the code?" "No. Why would I? To visit him after hours, perhaps. To help with inventory or paperwork. I'm a teacher." "Inspector, I don't know anything about running a hardware shop, and my father and we weren't close these past months. Not after he found out about Graham." Morrison leaned forward. "Tell us about your relationship with Graham Fraser." Sheila sighed. "Graham's kind and patient. He makes me laugh. We started as friends, then it became more. I knew my father wouldn't approve, so we kept it quiet at first. But Dad found out, and he was furious. He thought Graham was taking advantage, thought I was making a fool of myself. We argued about it constantly. Did you want your father to accept the relationship? Of course I did. I wanted Dad to see that Graham was a good man, that he made me happy. But Dad could be stubborn. Once he'd made up his mind about something, changing it was nearly impossible. How did that make you feel?" Morrison asked. Sheila's eyes filled with tears. Frustrated, angry, hurt. "He was my father. I loved him. But he was pushing me away over something that should have been my choice, not his. Angry enough to confront him?" Sheila's head snapped up. "What are you suggesting?" "We're just trying to understand the dynamics," Thomson said smoothly. "Your father was killed by someone he knew, someone he trusted enough to let into the shop after hours. You had a contentious relationship with him. You were involved with a man he was threatening to sack. It's natural that we consider all possibilities." "I didn't kill my father," Sheila said, her voice shaking. "How can you even think that? Where were you on the evening of March 8th between 6 and 8 p.m.? At home, correcting papers, preparing lessons for the next day. I was alone. No one can verify that?" "No. I live alone. The neighbors might have heard me moving about, but I didn't speak to anyone." Morrison consulted her notes. "You said you last saw your father 2 days before his death. What did you talk about?" "The usual. He asked how work was going. I asked about the shop. We carefully avoided mentioning Graham. It was strained and awkward, but we were trying to maintain some kind of relationship." "Did he mention any plans to sell the business?" Sheila looked surprised. "Sell? No. He never said anything about that. Why would he sell? The shop was his life." Thomson and Morrison exchanged glances. "Your father was actively looking for buyers," Thomson said. He had contacted estate agents, was having the property valued. You really didn't know? No, Sheila said slowly. He didn't tell me. But then, he hadn't been telling me much of anything lately. We weren't really communicating. Who would have been upset about him selling? Graham, I suppose. He'd lose his job. And Brian Kelley, the accountant. Dad was one of his long-term clients. Sheila paused. You think one of them killed him over the shop? We're exploring every possibility, Thomson said noncommittally. The interview continued for another hour. Thomson and Morrison probing every aspect of Sheila's relationship with her father, her whereabouts on the evening of the murder, her knowledge of his business affairs. By the end, Sheila was in tears, exhausted, and overwhelmed. Am I a suspect? She asked, as they prepared to let her leave. Everyone's a suspect until they're not, Thomson said. Don't leave the city without informing us. After Sheila left, Morrison turned to Thomson. What do you think? I think she's telling the truth about not having the alarm code, Thomson said. Her surprise about the sale seemed genuine, but she's still a possibility. The emotional intensity of the father-daughter conflict could have boiled over, or it could be exactly what it appears to be. A young woman who loved her father, but was frustrated by his controlling behavior. Thomson nodded. We need more evidence. Physical evidence connecting someone to the crime scene at the time of the murder. Right now, all we have is motive and opportunity for multiple suspects, but nothing solid enough to make an arrest. The case dragged on through March into April. The murder of Arthur MacLeod became a staple of local news coverage, with reporters speculating endlessly about possible motives and suspects. The headline "Robbery Gone Wrong" appeared in several papers, though the police had never confirmed that theory. Thomson received dozens of tips from the public, most of them useless. Someone claimed to have seen a suspicious person near the shop that evening, but the description was so vague it could have fit half of Glasgow. Another caller insisted Arthur had been involved in organized crime, but investigation revealed this to be complete fantasy. A psychic called to say she had communicated with Arthur's spirit, and he had told her the killer's name, which turned out to be someone who had died 3 years earlier. Through it all, Thomson kept returning to the basic facts. Arthur had been killed between 6 and 8 p.m. on March 8th. The murder weapon was from his own shop. There was no forced entry. The alarm had been properly disarmed. The cash register was untouched. These facts pointed inexorably toward someone Arthur knew and trusted, someone with access and knowledge. But without physical evidence or a confession, the case remained frustratingly unsolved. Chapter 6. 3 months after Arthur MacLeod's murder, Detective Inspector Thomson sat in his office staring at the case files spread across his desk. The investigation had hit a wall. Every lead had been followed. Every suspect interviewed and re-interviewed. Every piece of physical evidence analyzed and reanalyzed. And still, they were no closer to making an arrest than they had been on day 1. The forensic evidence remained frustratingly thin. The cigarette ash was interesting but not definitive. Bobby Sinclair smoked Embassy filter, but his alibi was rock solid. The wrench that killed Arthur bore only his own fingerprints, suggesting the killer had wiped it clean or worn gloves. No foreign DNA had been found at the scene beyond what you would expect in a shop visited by dozens of people daily. Thomson's instincts told him the answer lay with one of 3 people: Graham Fraser, Brian Kelley, or someone else Arthur had trusted enough to admit after hours. But instinct wasn't evidence, and without evidence, he couldn't make an arrest that would stick in court. Graham Fraser had moved out of Glasgow 2 weeks earlier, taking a job at a hardware chain in Edinburgh. Sheila had gone with him, the two of them finally free to pursue their relationship without Arthur's disapproval hanging over them. Thomson had interviewed them both before they left, searching for any hint of guilt, any crack in their stories. He found nothing. Graham remained consistent. He had left work at 5:45, gone straight home, spent the evening alone in his bedsit. His landlady remembered seeing him come in around 6, but couldn't be certain of the exact time. It was possible, just barely possible, that Graham had doubled back to the shop, killed Arthur, and returned home without being seen. But it would have required precise timing and extraordinary luck, and the motive, while present, seemed insufficient. Yes, Arthur had threatened Graham's job. Yes, he had tried to end the relationship with Sheila, but Graham had seemed more resigned than angry about the situation, more willing to wait Arthur out than to confront him violently. Brian Kelley had also left Glasgow, though in his case he had simply expanded his accounting practice, taking on new clients to replace the income he had lost when Arthur died. The building security guard confirmed that Kelley had been in his office until 8:30 on the evening of March 8th, though he couldn't confirm the exact time Kelley had arrived, or whether he might have left and returned during the evening. Thomson had dug deep into Arthur's financial records, looking for any evidence of fraud or embezzlement that might have given Kelley a stronger motive for murder. He found nothing. The accounts were immaculate, managed with professional precision. If Kelley had been stealing from Arthur, he had hidden it brilliantly. As spring turned to summer, the case began to fade from public consciousness. Other crimes demanded attention. Other murders needed solving. The investigation into Arthur MacLeod's death remained technically open, but the active work slowed, then stopped. Thomson kept the file on his desk, occasionally reviewing it when he had time, hoping that some overlooked detail would suddenly become clear. It never did. Chapter 7. 1 year after the murder, Sheila MacLeod stood in the cemetery where her father was buried, placing flowers on his grave. The headstone read simply, Arthur MacLeod, 1931-1984. Beloved father. She had wanted to add more, to find words that captured who he had been, but in the end, simplicity had seemed most appropriate. Graham stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. They had married 3 months earlier in a quiet ceremony in Edinburgh, with a handful of friends attending. Sheila had worn a simple dress rather than a traditional wedding gown, unwilling to celebrate too openly when her father's murder remained unsolved. I still think about him every day, Sheila said quietly. Wonder what he would think about us being married, whether he would have eventually come around, accepted that we were meant to be together. I think he would have, Graham said, though neither of them truly believed it. Arthur had been too stubborn, too convinced that Graham wasn't good enough for his daughter. They stood in silence for a few minutes, the Edinburgh wind carrying the scent of cut grass and distant rain. Finally, Sheila turned away from the grave, and they walked back to their car. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from behind a nearby oak tree, a person who had been there every week for the past year, visiting Arthur's grave when no one else was around, standing silent vigil over the man whose life had ended in violence and mystery. Chapter 8. 5 years after Arthur's death, in 1989, Detective Inspector Thomson retired from Strathclyde Police. At his retirement party, colleagues toasted his long career and his many successes. But Thomson knew that one failure would haunt him long after he turned in his badge: the unsolved murder of Arthur MacLeod. The case file went into storage, joining hundreds of other cold cases that would likely never be resolved. The physical evidence was boxed and catalogued, preserved in case some future breakthrough in forensic science might yield new answers. The witness statements and reports were archived, available for review, but no longer actively investigated. Thomson spent his retirement years gardening and reading detective novels, finding in fiction the satisfying conclusions that real life had denied him. But sometimes, late at night, he would pull out his personal notes on the MacLeod case and review them one more time, wondering what he had missed, what connection had eluded him. He died in 2003, never having solved the mystery that had bothered him most. Chapter 9. Brian Kelley lived quietly through the decades following Arthur's death. His accounting practice thrived, and he became known as one of the most reliable financial professionals in Glasgow. He married in 1987, had 2 children, became a pillar of his local community. To anyone who knew him, he was simply a successful, respectable businessman. But late at night, when his wife and children were asleep, Brian would sometimes lie awake thinking about that March evening in 1984, thinking about the argument that had escalated so quickly, thinking about the moment he had grabbed the wrench, not planning to use it, not intending to kill, just wanting to make Arthur listen, to make him understand. He hadn't meant to kill him. That's what Brian told himself in the dark hours. It had been an accident, a moment of rage that spiraled out of control. Arthur had been so dismissive, so certain that Brian's 15 years of service meant nothing, that losing him as a client was a minor inconvenience that Brian should simply accept. "You'll find other clients," Arthur had said, his tone maddeningly casual. "It's just business, Brian. Nothing personal." But it had been personal. Brian had poured himself into managing Arthur's accounts, had gone above and beyond what was required, had considered Arthur a friend as well as a client. And Arthur was going to discard him as easily as throwing away an old tool that no longer worked properly. The argument had grown heated. Words had been said that couldn't be unsaid. And then Brian's hand had fallen on the wrench, and everything had changed. He had been clever afterward, Brian thought with a strange mixture of pride and shame, wiping the wrench clean of his fingerprints. leaving by the back door, making sure no one saw him, going to his office, and establishing a timeline that put him there during the murder. The security guard had seen him leave at 8:30, just as he'd told the police, but the guard hadn't checked when he'd arrived. Brian had actually come to the office after killing Arthur, sitting at his desk for 2 hours, trying to compose himself before going home to his wife. The embassy filter cigarette ash had been a lucky break. Brian had never smoked, but Arthur sometimes allowed customers to smoke in the shop, against modern regulations. The ash could have been from anyone. The police had fixated on Bobby Sinclair, whose alibi had eliminated him, but drew attention away from Brian. 25 years later, in 2009, Brian Kelley suffered a massive heart attack while playing golf. He died on the way to the hospital, never having confessed his crime, never having faced justice for what he had done. His wife found his journals 6 months later while cleaning out his study. In cramped handwriting, Brian had documented everything: the argument with Arthur, the moment of violence, the careful covering of tracks, the years of guilt and sleepless nights. It was a confession written for himself, never intended to be found. Mrs. Kelley brought the journals to the police. The case was reopened briefly, but with the killer dead, there was no one to prosecute. The investigation confirmed what the journals revealed. Brian Kelley had murdered Arthur MacLeod in a moment of rage, then successfully hidden his crime for a quarter-century. Chapter 10. Sheila MacLeod Fraser was 62 years old when she received the call from Detective Constable Linda Murray of Strathclyde Police, now rebranded as Police Scotland. She was gardening in her Edinburgh home when the phone rang, her hands dirty with soil, her grey hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Mrs. Fraser, this is D.C. Murray from Police Scotland. I'm calling regarding your father's case, Arthur MacLeod." Sheila's heart began to pound. 25 years had passed since her father's murder. She had long ago given up hope that it would ever be solved. "Yes? Have you found something?" "We have," Murray said gently. "The case has been solved. The perpetrator was Brian Kelley, your father's accountant. He documented his confession in personal journals that his widow found after his death. I'm very sorry it took so long to get you answers." Sheila sat down heavily on her garden bench, the phone pressed to her ear, emotions flooding through her. Relief that there was finally an answer. Anger that Brian had escaped justice. Sorrow that her father had been killed by someone he considered a friend. And underneath it all, a strange kind of vindication. "Graham didn't do it," she said, though she had never truly believed he had. "It wasn't him." "No, ma'am. Your husband was never seriously considered a suspect, despite some early questions. The evidence always pointed away from him." After the call ended, Sheila sat in her garden for a long time, thinking about her father, about the years they had lost to stubbornness and pride, about the relationship they might have had if he hadn't been killed. Graham found her there an hour later, tears streaming down her face. "They solved it," she told him. "After all these years, they finally know who killed him." Graham held her while she cried. For her father, for the wasted years, for the senselessness of violence, and the long wait for justice. Epilogue. The hardware shop on Maryhill Road stood empty for 3 years after Arthur's death before being sold to a pharmacy chain. The shelves that had once held tools and paint were stripped out, replaced by aisles of cosmetics and medications. The back room where Arthur died was converted into a storage area, all traces of the crime scene erased by renovation and time. The people who shopped at the pharmacy now had no idea that a murder had occurred there. The story had faded from community memory, replaced by newer tragedies and scandals. Only a few older residents remembered Arthur MacLeod and his shop, remembered the shocking murder that had consumed neighborhood gossip for months. In 2015, a crime writer named David Crawford published a book about unsolved murders in Scotland. One chapter was devoted to Arthur's case, titled The Accountant's Secret. The book revealed Brian Kelley's confession and explored the psychology of seemingly respectable people who commit terrible crimes. The book brought renewed attention to the case, sparking discussions about guilt, justice, and whether closure was possible when the perpetrator escaped earthly punishment. Some readers felt cheated that Brian had lived a full life before dying unpunished. Others found a kind of grim satisfaction in knowing that he had carried his guilt for 25 years, unable to escape it even in death. Sheila Fraser read the book at the urging of her daughter, now herself a grown woman with children of her own. She found it difficult but cathartic, seeing her father's story told with care and respect. The writer had contacted her during his research, and she had shared memories of Arthur, painting a picture of a complex man who was stubborn and principled, difficult and loyal, capable of great kindness and maddening inflexibility. He deserved better, Sheila said to Graham after finishing the book. He deserved to grow old, to meet his grandchildren, to see that we made a good life together despite his objections. Yes, Graham agreed. He did. They were 70 years old now, Graham having recently retired from the hardware chain where he had worked for 3 decades. They had built a good life in Edinburgh, raised a daughter who became a lawyer, accumulated the small contentments that make a life meaningful. But Arthur's murder had cast a long shadow, a reminder of how quickly violence can shatter the ordinary, how a single moment of rage can ripple across decades. In 2020, Sheila returned to Glasgow for the first time in years. She stood outside the building that had once been her father's shop, now a Boots pharmacy, and tried to remember what it had looked like when Arthur was alive. The green-painted front, the gold lettering, the cluttered window displays, the smell of linseed oil and metal dust. It was all gone now, erased by time and commerce, and the city's endless transformation. But Sheila could still see it in her mind's eye, could still picture her father standing behind the counter, helping a customer find the right size screw, explaining the difference between various types of paint, taking pride in knowing his stock and his trade. "I forgive you, Dad," she whispered to the ghost of the past, "for being stubborn and difficult, for trying to control my life, for all the arguments and wasted time. I forgive you, and I hope you forgave me too." The street was busy with afternoon shoppers, people hurrying past on their way to appointments and errands, none of them aware of the woman standing still in the flow of movement, communing with memories and ghosts. Sheila stood there for 10 minutes, then turned and walked away, back toward the train station, back toward Edinburgh, back toward the life she had built in the years since Arthur died. The case was solved. The killer was known. Justice, in its imperfect, delayed way, had been served. It wasn't the ending anyone had wanted, but it was the ending they had. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it had to be. Arthur MacLeod was murdered on March 8, 1984, in his hardware shop on Maryhill Road in Glasgow. He was killed by Brian Kelley, his accountant of 15 years, in a moment of rage over a business decision. The murder went unsolved for 25 years, until Kelley's death and the discovery of his confessional journals finally provided answers. The case became a reminder that some mysteries are eventually solved, though not always in the ways we expect or in timeframes we find satisfactory. It demonstrated that guilt can be carried silently for decades, that seemingly ordinary people can harbor terrible secrets, and that the consequences of violence extend far beyond the immediate victim, rippling through families and communities for generations. Arthur MacLeod's shop is gone now, replaced by a pharmacy that serves a different purpose for a new generation. But the story of what happened there remains, a dark chapter in Glasgow's history, a cautionary tale about pride and anger, and the terrible things that can happen when conflicts escalate beyond the point of reason. The hardware shopkeeper who was murdered in 1984, supposedly during a robbery gone wrong, actually died because of hurt feelings and wounded pride, killed by a man he had trusted, in a crime that would remain hidden for a quarter century. That's the real story. Not robbery, not a random act of violence, but something more human, more tragic, and ultimately more disturbing. A friendship destroyed, a moment of rage, and decades of silence that finally ended not with justice but with death, and a confession found too late.